Nothing says I've never built a car quite like complaining in the comments that this project isn't done yet. But for everybody that knows how this stuff goes, you know that the last 10% of a build takes 90% of the time. Now, thankfully, I think we're further than 90% in. We've got less than 10% left. But the things on our list are going to nickel and dime our time to death. So the only way to get to the finish line and get this thing driving down the road is to keep chipping away at it. So let's get to it. Surprisingly, it's been over 3 weeks since our last Ferrari episode, and that is, without a doubt, the longest break we've had. We left off in the last episode having finished up the design phase for custom quick-release mounts for our front splitter. I had a few design constraints that I wanted to meet, and this is where we landed. Somewhere between then and now, all of our laser cut parts arrived from Send Cut Send, and now it's just a matter of putting it all together. We've got a mix of mild steel and aluminum parts, each serving a different purpose in different places on the car. Obviously, steel is needed to mount to the chassis itself, while aluminum is used to keep the weight down where we can. The first order of business is to actually weld up the brackets that are going to attach to the splitter itself. And I got these pieces in both steel and aluminum, but we're going to start with the steel pieces because I can keep the weld profile lower, and I know the hardware will clear whatever welds I put on it. We can put the aluminum counterparts on after we're finished with final mock-up. Next on the list is to build the parts that are going to go through the splitter, a way for us to physically attach these brackets to the carbon fiber. We're going to pass bolts through the splitter and into these weld nuts that we're going to weld to oversized washers. I think these would do the trick, but some of you guys did suggest to laser cut a structure that can go underneath the splitter to help distribute the load, and it would still have the same advantages of not having bolt heads hanging down that can get ground down. I really like that suggestion, so we're going to do that further down the road and use these for mock-up. The last thing that we need in order to assemble the splitter mounts is to machine some guide pins. And to put it simply, these are what will carry the load that the splitter generates. Initially, I had just considered welding bolts to the bracket, but I think having these turned down pieces will be a much nicer finished result. I turned them down to be a tolerance fit to the bracket itself, pressed them into place, and then took them over to the workbench and did a rosette weld on the backside. With everything assembled, I can finally show you how this bracket's going to work. The rear hook grabs on first, and then the splitter can rotate up and then is guided into place. A pit pin locks it all together and keeps the splitter on the car. I'm really happy with how this turned out, and I think it looks pretty professional. And I want to remind you guys that you can make parts that look just like this with Send Cut Send. And I've even got a 15% discount code to make making parts like these even cheaper. But our design does have one flaw. It's that technically the pit pin is a little bit too long. We could solve this problem by simply machining a spacer for the backside of the steel, but I'd rather come up with something a little bit more simple. In one of my cabinets, I found a box of assorted springs and happened to find some that fit on the pit pins perfectly. With the spring in place, the pit pin now clamps the parts beautifully, and I don't have to worry about it rattling, nor do I have to worry about the splitter having some sloppy movement. So now we need to install these parts, and that means removing the aluminum brace that we added many episodes ago. As cool as it is, it's going to be in the way for actually welding on the steel braces for the skid plate itself. On top of that, there's still a lot of bits and pieces attached to the Ferrari chassis that it came with from the factory. I couldn't tell you why they're there, but now's our chance to get rid of them and clean this thing up. It does feel a little bit like polishing a turd because the Ferrari chassis is absolutely terrible, but why not make it as nice as we can, since it's not much work. With the paint cleaned off and the surfaces ready to weld, we can actually test fit the part for the first time, but I was a little bit too confident when I designed this part and didn't check my work, and the result is a part that doesn't fit. This is likely because I used a paper template and didn't follow up to make sure that I measured everything correctly. Paper is a lot less rigid than metal. As you can see, if we have the bottom lined up down here, there is a gap at the top or a gap on the bottom. I could do some massaging and get this to fit, but then we're going to lose our parallel lines because I'd have to cut, kind of an angle from this point down to the other one with an increasing amount cut off as we go down. So it would wind up looking bad. or at least I know that it would be that way, and I don't want to scab this in to make it work. I want it to be right. So let's scrap this and do it again. Lots of you guys are definitely gonna say, dude, what does it matter? It's under the car, it's a bracket, just massage it, make it fit. And I did think about doing that. I cut this one, you can see that top is a little bit thinner. But as said, this isn't the right way. I'm losing material that I'm welding to. It needs to get cut more. It's not gonna be straight. And I'm just not gonna be happy with it. I'm not gonna put it on the car. I don't need to rush this. There's no reason to do that. I'm not under a time crunch. And if I do it this way, it's gonna bug me. Even if it's under the car, even if nobody else sees it after this episode, I'm not gonna be happy with it. So we're gonna scrap this, we're gonna do it again. Yeah, I'm bummed about that. That's kind of screws me for what I wanted to get done. So in that case, let's move to the back of the car and work on our oil scavenge tank. We didn't finish it up. I'll talk about what we're gonna do. Let's get it plumbed in. Let's get that knocked off the list. A few episodes ago, we built a scavenge tank. This is going to collect oil from the turbo and allows the scavenge pump to send it back to our dry sump tank. But as some of you guys pointed out, we didn't add a vent to it. So we need to pull it back out of the car, add a vent, and make the lines so that it's plumbed. To keep this simple, I'm just adding a port to the top rear corner of this thing. Instead of using an AN port though, I decided on NPT threads, which gives us a few more options in terms of what we can actually install here. Ultimately, I think we're going to go with a hose barb with a line run up towards the top of the car and a filter on the end. The raised filter and end of the hose should help prevent any leakage or spillage during high G-force turns. With the tank reinstalled, now we need to make the hose to plumb it in. I finally bought a set of new soft jaws for AN fittings after the others were marring up every fitting that I used. As always, I'm using AN fittings from Vibrant Performance thanks to their ease of assembly. You can install the hose in the ferrule by hand, and then it's just a matter of using a wrench to assemble the fitting itself. Because we're going to have a diffuser underneath the back of the car in the future, I decided to run this hose over the chassis member. It creates a bit of a high point, but I don't think the pump will have any problem with it. With these hoses done and the barb installed on top, we can finally cross this thing off of the list and move on to the next project. But we're not going very far, we're going to stay right here with this turbo. We really need an intake and an air filter, and I've been trying to decide this entire time exactly how to accomplish that. We don't have much room to route intake piping away from where we are now, so it's a bit of a decision on how to just best handle the situation. Once again, I want to use a Vibrant HD clamp to actually couple the tubing to the turbo just like we did on the outlet. I know we've covered Vibrant HD clamps before, but they're so cool that I can't help but at least talk about them for a brief moment. And I say this as somebody who paid for them, not was given them. HD clamps work by utilizing a pair of ferrules wrapped in O-rings, which are then inserted into a union sleeve. Finally, an aluminum locking collar locks the entire assembly together. They're a replacement for a silicone coupler and hose clamps. But the positive side is that they have an 800 psi burst pressure, they can withstand 400 degree intake temps, and they have some freedom of movement, which means you can solid mount your components like an intercooler and still allow your engine to move on its mounts without breaking everything. Lastly, they don't require any tools to remove, which makes serviceability as good as it gets. Now, let's get this thing attached to the turbo. The intake is huge. This is a 4-inch HD clamp, which requires 4-inch piping. That means, along with the turbo manifold and the exhaust, we're going to need to build another intake when we swap to the smaller turbo later down the line. So I'm not going to spend too much time trying to make some ornate or beautiful intake, because it's not that big of a deal. The only real requirement for this thing is to get up and away from the turbo and try to get to the opposite side of the engine bay as the exhaust itself. That's where most of our heat will come from. only going to tack everything together for the time being, because we need to pull the turbo housing back off of the car to fully weld both ferrules, so we'll do the intake at the same time. Now I know once you guys see this thing in place, some of you are going to feel the need to comment about how I'm sucking in hot air because the intake is in the engine bay, but this thing's going to work fine. Don't sweat it so much. Ideally, we'll just pull some air in from the wheel well, and it'll have a fresh supply. Now it's time for a new tool, and this one is one you need to add to your collection. We all know the feeling of running out of brake clean and having a can run dry, and this tool solves that problem entirely. It turns out you can buy brake clean by the gallon. In fact, you can order a 55-gallon drum of it if you really feel a need to. With this SureShot tool, you can actually fill it up, and then using shop air, you can pressurize it whenever you need to. And that's kind of like having a cheat code for unlimited ammo if your ammo is brake cleaner. And if you're like me, you'll go through a lot of it. My first real use for it was getting all of the oil off of our lines and fittings after I disconnected the oil pump for our scavenge tank earlier in the episode. But it turns out if you drain all of that oil into a cup and then kick it over while you're filming, it does a great job of cleaning your floor as well. Alright, enough of that, back to work. The next project on the car requires removing the rear wheels because, as plenty of you would probably guess, there's still a lot of stuff in here we need to get done. Embarrassingly, the original soft lines and hard lines for the rear brakes are still installed in the back of the car. I never bothered to remove them earlier in the project, so better late than never, we need to get them removed and thrown in the trash. With the lines out of the way, we can actually cut the original mounts off of the chassis. Our new rear brake lines don't go this far back in the car, so we're not going to reuse them. Now, flashback, some of you guys might remember when we cut some chassis members out of this car for axle and engine clearance all the way back in some of the very first episodes of this build. In the episodes that followed, we did add quite a bit of structure back into the car, but there is a bracket that we designed and never actually installed. It's been well over a year since I've seen those templates, so we're going to start over, design some new templates, and get some structure reinstalled on the back of this car. With all the improvements we've made, I'm pretty confident the chassis is going to be stronger than it ever was before. We're going to make these out of some scrap 1/8-inch plate steel that I had sitting in the shop, and as is necessary with everything that sits around here, we've got to knock the rust off. With the templates transferred over to the steel and then the steel cut up on the bandsaw, we can finally use our brand new disc sander. At least that was my hope, until it started shaking violently and then throwing smoke out of the side of it. I don't know much about this thing in terms of how it works. I don't know electric motors at all, but there's apparently a brake inside of this and it's stuck on. I have tried wiring it every possible way. I can't get it to turn off. It might just be like malfunctioning, might just not turn off. But yeah, there's a brake. This doesn't want to spin, so that's our problem. Back to the drawing board, back to the tiny little Ryobi bell sander. So we're back to Old Faithful, and while it is slow, it always does the trick. Cleaning up the edges of 1/8-inch plate steel is a bit time-consuming, but as always, it's best to let the sander do the work. Don't try to force it, or you're just going to create problems for yourself. I decided I wanted to put dimple dies in the middle of these plates, at least just to make them somewhat visually interesting, and admittedly, a little bit stronger. Because this is an abstract shape, I just eyeballed the center, drilled the holes, and then went over to our arbor press and got them punched. The dies that I have will actually punch the proper size hole in them and only require a 1/2-inch drill to be passed through the plate initially, but because of that, they do deform the plate if the plate is too small like you see here. But we can remedy this by simply taking the bottom half of the die, flipping the whole thing over, and pressing it back the other direction. Now, in order to get these things welded in, we've got to clean old paint off of the chassis. It's also best if we get the welds from those old brake tabs ground down and get all of this stuff smooth. Now, to answer the question that I know is coming, yes, eventually we'll get the entire engine bay stripped and painted, but I don't want to do that until I know we're done with every bit of fabrication. It's pretty low on the to-do list, as it's definitely not going to help us get this thing to drive. With the first plate tacked into place, it's time to get the other one installed. The only problem is I made them both late on a Sunday with a desire to go home, so it means I dimple-dyed it the wrong direction, and then I did it a second time. So I had to make this thing 3 times before I got it right. But the outcome is looking pretty good, and I decided to dimple the holes outwards to match the fuel cell strap in the engine bay in case anyone sees both at the same time. I do think we'll need to modify the driver's side for clearance, but I'm only going to leave it tacked into place until we have our axles to confirm. Alright guys, that is it. That's all I have for this episode. If you like this episode, please leave a like. If you haven't subscribed yet, you should. Those methods of support help me and help other creators like me. So if you like the content somebody's making, whether it's me or anybody else, leave a like and subscribe. Those show the YouTube algorithm that you like what they're doing, that you support that type of content, and it helps creators like us grow, and we can keep making videos like these. With all that said, I have some closing thoughts for this episode. I did name it The Last 10% Takes 90% of the Time for a reason. I'm at that point in this build where it's the last 10% and it's all small, relatively boring things. The jobs that are left aren't big, exciting ones. There's not, oh, we get to start the car up, or, oh, we're gonna fabricate this big, cool piece. There are still big jobs left to do, especially driving the thing, but it's all checklist items at this point, and it's a matter of just chipping away at it, getting through it. And this part of a build can be very frustrating. It can even be demotivating. It's not really burnout, that's not the right word. I'm still excited to work on the car, but the reason I share this sentiment, if you will, is because I truly believe it to be relatable. I think anybody that has built a car like this, of really any scale, you've been here. And if you're thinking about tackling a project like this, you're gonna feel this way. It happens. And I'm sharing it because I think a lot of other YouTube channels probably gloss over this aspect of a build. There is a very real sense of, yeah, I don't know, frustration, or maybe you'll feel burnt out. Things like that. But the only way to get through it is you gotta keep chipping away at it. Your project won't get done unless you finish it. It's the only way for it to happen. And honestly, that's probably why I've produced less 308 episodes lately. I'm at this point where the jobs aren't as fulfilling as those big, exciting ones, and it leads me to feel like some of these episodes are kind of dragging on at this point. And so I need some feedback from you guys. If you've made it this far in the episode, I'm sure you wanna see everything that I produce. If you haven't made it this far, I don't know, we're gonna have a survivorship bias in my answers here, but I'm just trying to decide how much of these small details I continue to show. Do I space out these episodes, focus on things like the Audi, and make the 308 episodes a bit more packed like this one? Do we try to keep going once or twice a week? Let me know what you guys want to see. I just want to make sure that I'm producing what you guys want to watch. I mean, at the end of the day, I'm going to produce what I want to produce, and I'm going to do the things that I want to do. It's just a matter of figuring out how to divide up that time so that you guys enjoy it too, and I'm producing content that everybody's excited about, not just me. So leave me some feedback, leave some comments, let me know. If we want to keep focusing on the really tiny details it's going to take to get this thing finished up, I'll keep showing them. Otherwise, I'll space these episodes out and we'll see what kind of big chunks we can cross off the list. With all that said, I'll catch you guys at the end of the week. We're going to work on the Audi. I'm excited for it. Thank you guys so much for the support. I'll see you then.